The chamber was already humming with tension, but when Hillary Clinton rose to speak, you could feel the air crackle, like the static before a storm. Marco Rubio had just delivered another smug, calculated jab, the kind that plays well for cameras but wilts under real scrutiny. His grin suggested confidence, his posture arrogance. But Clinton's eyes told another story. This wasn't going to be politics as usual. She paused, letting the silence stretch. Senators shifted, journalists leaned forward. The audience sensed that something seismic was about to unfold. Then, in a voice both steady and sharp, Clinton began dismantling Rubio's careful facade. Not with shouting, not with theatrics, but with precision, the kind of precision that cuts deeper than anger. Rubio tried to interrupt, waving his hands, tossing out deflections, but suddenly the room was no longer his. Clinton's remarks weren't, just directed at the senator from Florida. They pierced through the marble halls, aimed straight at a broader truth and the hypocrisy sitting across from her. Each word was measured, deliberate, heavy with the weight of lived experience and resolve. The chamber erupted. Some gasps, some faint applause quickly stifled, journalists scribbling like mad. For a moment, Rubio's famous composure faltered. He reached for his water bottle. His hand shook just enough for the cameras to notice, and just like that, the first strike had landed. What looked like a routine capital exchange was no longer routine at all. The clash had begun, and nobody knew just how far it would spiral. To grasp why this moment mattered, you have to see beyond the marble pillars and ornate ceilings. This wasn't just Clinton versus Rubio. It was two visions of America colliding, in real time. One side draped itself in empty slogans, promising strength while quietly undermining the very people who build the nation's backbone. The other side stood rooted in conviction, a refusal to let bluster drown out dignity. For years, Rubio had painted himself as the polished messenger for a party increasingly defined by division. His carefully rehearsed speeches leaned on identity, only when convenient, while his voting record told a starkly different story, striking down immigration reforms, resisting protections for working families, and mocking communities whose stories he never bothered to learn. Yet here he was again, framing himself as a son of immigrants while sneering at policies that would help others chase the very dream his family once pursued. Clinton knew the stakes weren't just political talking points. This clash embodied the struggles of millions of Americans whose voices never reached the Senate floor. The single mother waiting for citizenship papers. The student juggling two jobs while dreaming of becoming the first in their family to graduate. The refugee who sees America not as an abstract promise, but as a lifeline. Every remark Rubio made risked diminishing those lives to bargaining chips, while every line Clinton delivered reclaimed their humanity. The contrast was electric and dangerous. The cameras broadcasted more than words. They captured a fight for America's soul, for the meaning of belonging, for the promise of possibility against the lure of exclusion. And in that chamber, amid the sparks of confrontation, one thing became certain. This wasn't going to be just another headline to scroll past. What happens next changes everything. Marco Rubio's career has always been a tale of contradictions, an American success story carefully wrapped in layers of hollow performance. He tells audiences about his parents, Cuban immigrants who worked, themselves weary so their children could rise higher. It's a story meant to inspire, to assure working people that the man on stage understands their struggles. But behind the narrative lies a record soaked in hypocrisy, a career built less on lived values and more on political calculus. Rubio learned early that charm could substitute for substance. With polished delivery and a rehearsed smile, he cast himself as the next generation of leadership, the fresh face of conservatism. Yet time and again, when moments demanded courage, he chose expedience. Immigration reform, the issue closest to his own biography, became the clearest flashpoint. When bipartisan efforts surged forward, Rubio basked in the spotlight, touting his role in crafting a pathway to citizenship. But when the far-right backlash roared, he folded, abandoning the very plan he once championed. His supporters were left bewildered, immigrants betrayed. It wasn't an isolated pattern. When issues of climate, healthcare, and voting rights arose, Rubio's voice faltered into echoes of partisan talking points. He promised solutions, then cast votes that deepened the very problems he claimed to address. And each time he returned to the stage, he polished the mask again, pretending the contradictions didn't exist. His survival depended on repetition. Repeat the story of humble roots. Ignore the disconnect, smile for the cameras, let the headlines fade. The arrogance was not just in his policy reversals, but in his posture. Rubio seemed to believe that his performance alone could shield him from accountability, that eloquent phrases and quick deflections could conceal the harm beneath. He relished status, basked in attention, and courted applause while refusing to see the faces of those his decisions overlooked. His water bottle slip during a State of the Union response became a metaphor that lingered. For all the poise he projected, a nervous fragility buzzed just beneath the surface. Most revealing, however, was his disdain for those who dared to confront him. Journalists who pressed too hard were accused of bias. Opponents who questioned his record were brushed off as partisan attackers. And constituents, especially immigrants who asked why he had abandoned them, were met with slippery evasions, as though real lives were inconvenient props in his own performance. This was the man who now stood across from Hillary Clinton, armed, once again with the practiced grin and the manufactured talking points. He had built his career on being untouchable, a product perfectly designed for the political market. But in the Capitol showdown, the mask was cracking, the contradictions too glaring, the arrogance too visible. And for the first time in years, Marco Rubio wasn't facing a pliant press corps or a friendly rally crowd. He was facing someone unwilling to play along, and the downfall he never thought possible was inching ever closer. Hillary Clinton's story was never one of shortcuts or easy applause. Her journey began not in the halls of power, but in the middle class, neighborhoods of suburban Illinois, where she absorbed the values of hard work, faith, and the stubborn belief that service was supposed to mean something. To her, politics was not a podium for self-promotion, but a responsibility, a chance to tilt the arc of justice just a little further toward fairness. As a young woman, she felt the sting of a culture still unwilling to see women as equal participants in the national story. Law schools were filled with students who dismissed her presence as an oddity, professors who hinted that her talents were wasted in lecture halls instead of kitchens. Rather than cower, she sharpened her focus. Her early work with the Children's Defense Fund revealed her natural compass. She was drawn not to the spotlight, but to the shadows, working with children with disabilities, families in poverty, and communities rarely given a platform. In Arkansas, she fought quietly, often against the grain, to expand opportunities for rural children. Her efforts were unglamorous: school reform, legal aid, healthcare expansion, but they mattered most to those who had been left out of the larger American miracle. As First Lady, when critics tried to box her into ceremonial silence, she broke, free with the audacious conviction that women's rights are human rights. It was a line felt not as a slogan, but as a gauntlet thrown down on behalf of millions whose voices were long ignored. Her career was a mosaic of resilience. U.S. Senator, Secretary of State, presidential candidate. At every turn, she endured sharper scrutiny than her peers, her ambitions dissected, her tone policed, her very right to stand at the podium questioned. Yet she remained undeterred, returning again and again stronger, sharper, more relentless. This iron endurance taught her the art of composure under fire, the ability to remain steady while storms raged, to answer arrogance not with theatrics but with stubborn clarity. It was that clarity that prepared her for showdowns like this. Where others saw politics as theater, she saw a moral test. And each scar, each battle, each moment of dismissal layered into a resilience rare in public life. For Clinton, standing in the Capitol chamber wasn't about scoring a victory over Rubio for the cameras. It was about every immigrant turned away by hypocrisy, every woman told to wait her turn, every family left invisible by policies crafted for political convenience. It was about keeping faith with the people whose stories shaped her own convictions, that politics must mean more than personal advancement, that dignity is worth defending in public combat, even when the cost is high. Her detractors mocked her, relentlessness as ambition. But ambition without purpose burns out quickly. Hers had been sustained for decades by something deeper, an unshakable loyalty to the idea that America could be kinder, fairer, wiser if powerful people chose service over self. That belief, tested by failures and forged by endurance, gave her a calmness in conflict that no insult could erode. Now, as she faced Rubio across the room, that lifetime of trial and perseverance condensed into a singular readiness. This was the arena she had been forged for, the clash of values against vanity, conviction against calculation. And the moment demanded not just experience but courage wedded to grace. Every scar had led her here, every battle had prepared her hand. The Capitol chamber waited, hungry for spectacle. Clinton, however, was steady. She wasn't there for spectacle. She was there for history, ready to strike when it mattered most. The opening exchange was fiery enough, but soon the temperature in the chamber began to climb. Rubio, sensing that Clinton's first strike had landed too close for comfort, leaned forward with a smirk that was meant to signal control. His voice grew sharper, his tone almost taunting. He tossed out lines meant to sting, accusations that she was out of touch, insinuations that her decades of service were worn-out baggage, barbs about failed campaigns. Each remark was curated for the soundbite, aimed more at the cameras than at his opponent. Clinton didn't bite. She met his words with the composure of someone who had weathered far worse storms. The contrast was glaring. While Rubio grew more animated, his hands slicing the air, his volume rising, she replied with calm clarity, each sentence cleaner and more measured than the last. She didn't have to shout. Her restraint was the louder weapon. The insults sharpened. He mocked her as reliving the past, hinted at her career full of excuses, and finally, with a grin too wide to mask the tremor in his voice, implied that she stood for nothing but ambition. It was the kind of jab designed to belittle, to reduce a lifetime of service into a cheap caricature. The chamber stirred. The arrogance in Rubio's tone was starting to grate, not just on Clinton, but on the audience watching. Some eyes rolled in quiet disbelief, others narrowed with focus. Journalists scribbled furiously. This wasn't just political banter anymore, it was turning into a duel. Clinton let him finish. She held her ground without flinching, her calm expression landing heavier than any verbal retort. And then, with a voice softened just enough to let the silence do the work, she answered, not with anger, but with poise. Each word was a counterweight to his shouting, each phrase landing with devastating precision. And that calmness, that composure, rattled Rubio more than any insult could have. You could see it, the flash of irritation, the stumble in timing, the way his laughter slipped into nervousness. The escalation was no longer about who could shout loudest. It was about who could stand tallest. And in that moment, the entire chamber knew. The higher Rubio raised his voice, the smaller he appeared next to the dignity across from him. Clinton was waiting. The tide of the clash was about to turn. The chamber grew taut, like a string pulled too tight. Every jab Rubio hurled bounced against Clinton's silence until the tension became almost unbearable. The audience sat suspended, waiting for the break, the strike, the moment where composure finally transformed into fire. Then it happened. Clinton's eyes swept the chamber, and when she spoke, her voice carried not just authority, but finality. Calm, steady, deliberate. No shouting, no theatrics, just precision sharpened over decades, cutting through the clutter like steel. She began by recounting his favorite story, his parents' immigrant struggle, their arrival with nothing, their hope for a better life. She honored their sacrifice, and then, with surgical clarity, turned the story against him. How dare he, she pressed, use his family's journey as a campaign prop while working to deny the same chance to others standing where they once stood. The words hit hard, not as an insult but as truth stripped bare. The chamber rippled with reaction. Gasps echoed, murmurs spread, reporters froze mid-scribble. Rubio shifted in his seat, his face tightening, the mask faltering. For years he had wielded that story as armor. Now Clinton had transformed it into indictment. She didn't stop. His record was laid out like evidence on trial, votes against education access, against immigration reform, against the very lifelines his family once relied upon. And yet, she noted, he cloaked himself in moral superiority, as though ambition excused betrayal. Each sentence was a hammer. Each pause allowed the weight of silence to land heavier than a shout ever could. Rubio tried to interject. His voice, rising, cracking, but the crowd now leaned toward Clinton's side of the chamber. Her words threaded through the air with a momentum impossible to interrupt. Then, with perfect timing, she delivered the final blow. Your story should have been a reason to open doors. Instead, you've chosen to slam them shut. History will remember the difference. The room erupted, audible gasps, even scattered applause breaking protocol. Some senators exchanged glances, others simply sat stunned. Rubio shifted again, reaching instinctively for his water bottle, the nervous tick returning like a tell on a card sharp. This time, the cameras caught it all. In the silence that followed, Clinton's gaze didn't waver. She had landed the strike. The mic drop counterattack wasn't noisy. It was unshakable. For the first time in the showdown, Rubio had no comeback. The crowd knew it. He knew it. And as the weight of her words lingered, the chamber braced itself. The aftermath wasn't just waiting outside. It was already surging in. The moment Clinton's words hit the airwaves, the reaction was immediate and volcanic. Clips of her takedown spread across Twitter within minutes, clipped into 15-second bursts that perfectly captured Rubio's stunned silence and her line about slamming doors shut. By the time the session adjourned, hashtags were already trending nationwide. Doors open, Clinton counter, and Rubio shaken rocketed to the top of feeds. Memes multiplied at lightning speed. Rubio clutching his water bottle superimposed with captions, like thirsty for a comeback or hydrate those hypocrisies. Side-by-side images of Clinton calmly speaking while Rubio squirmed became instant viral fodder, shared by celebrities, activists, and ordinary users alike. TikToks featuring dramatic slow-motion replays of the exchange set to escalating music exploded in popularity, framing her mic drop moment as if it were a pivotal scene in an epic film. But it wasn't just social media theatrics. The ripple effects cut deeper. Commentators from mainstream outlets described the exchange as a turning point in the larger debate over immigration and American values. On late-night shows, comedians skewered Rubio with merciless flair, portraying him as a politician who brought a knife to a gunfight and dropped the knife halfway through. Meanwhile, progressive organizers seized the energy, flooding inboxes with messages declaring, "If Clinton can stand tall in that chamber, we can stand tall in our neighborhoods." Communities of immigrants and their allies felt a shared surge, a validation. For many, Clinton's words echoed decades of lived frustration, that too often their stories are twisted into props by politicians who don't fight for them. Suddenly, those frustrations had been voiced with clarity and dignity on one of the nation's largest stages. And Rubio? His attempted spin fell flat. In interviews afterward, his polished smile looked frayed, his talking points recycled, and empty against the backdrop of viral footage still spreading across millions of screens. Every defensive word only reminded viewers of the footage they had already seen, the humiliation they had already replayed. The Capitol clash had leapt from marble halls into American living rooms, smartphones, and coffee shop conversations. The question now wasn't whether people had noticed. It was how far the shockwaves would travel. Because beneath the viral jokes and hashtags pulsed something heavier, a cultural reckoning about who we are, who gets to belong, and how leaders are remembered when the facade comes crashing down. As the noise of pundits and memes thundered around the country, Clinton stepped back into the light, not to gloat, not to pound the table over a viral victory, but to reframe what the clash truly meant. In interviews and speeches following the showdown, her words took on a wider lens. She reminded listeners that politics wasn't about humiliating opponents, or even about scoring that one devastating line. It was, at its best, about defining what America chooses to stand for. She spoke about her own family, about the long thread of people who arrive in this country chasing possibilities that don't exist elsewhere. She reminded the nation that immigrant struggles are not anecdotes for campaign rallies, but living, breathing testaments to American promise. And then she turned her fire into something larger, saying that the divide exposed on that Senate floor was not simply between her and Senator Rubio, but between cynicism and belief, exclusion and belonging, selfishness and service. It struck a chord, because beyond the applause, beyond hashtags and viral clips, the lesson resonated as universal. Dignity does not shout down. Truth does not need to embellish. And the real measure of leadership is not in how loud one speaks, but in how faithfully one defends those without a microphone. Her calm counterattack had become symbolic, a reminder that arrogance unravels under the weight of sincerity. Viewers across the country recognized themselves in her steadiness. Immigrants who refused to shrink, mothers who carried entire families on their backs, young people carving out futures in a world not built for their success. The moral was simple, yet profound. America's strength has never come from those who close doors, but from those who open them, even when the cost is high. The showdown in the Capitol wasn't just a dramatic clash of two politicians. It was a crystallization of what kind of nation we are determined to be. And though the dust was still settling, one thing had become impossible to deny. Dignity had defeated arrogance. Principles had triumphed over opportunism. And in a time of constant division, that chamber reminded the world that power built on truth does more than win debates. It lights a path forward. And so, the moment that began as just another Capitol exchange became something unforgettable. Hillary Clinton exposing Marco Rubio in a heated showdown that stripped away arrogance and revealed the power of steady truth. The title wasn't exaggeration. It was the reality played out before the nation's eyes. A clash framed not by shouting matches or empty gestures, but by the force of dignity overwhelming the frailty of bluster. This wasn't simply about winning an argument. It was about reminding America of a universal truth. Our democracy is strongest when it is anchored by compassion, honesty, and the courage to defend those who are too often silenced. Where Rubio leaned on performance, Clinton leaned on purpose. And in that difference lay the lesson that resonated far beyond the marble floors of the chamber. We are living in a time when spectacle tries to replace substance, when leaders chase headlines instead of change. But the Capitol showdown showed us something we can carry forward, that calm persistence, rooted in values, can still cut through noise. That we have a choice, to glorify arrogance or to uplift those who stand unwavering in defense of others. If this moment inspired you, if it reminded you why integrity matters, why voices like Clinton's resonate, then don't let it fade into tomorrow's feed. Be part of amplifying it. Share this video, subscribe to this channel, and join the movement of people who refuse to confuse arrogance with strength. Because when we stand together, when we lift dignity above cynicism, we don't just watch history unfold, we help write it.